6,000 members. Being that we are a large chapter, we are subdivided into 8 sections. You see the map there of the 8 section. Alex Hines and I represent the northern section, which includes the San Francisco Bay Area that encompasses 16 counties along or near the coast of the Pacific Ocean in the northern half of the state. Both Alex Hines and I serve as the international director of the northern section. Next slide, Roberto.
All right.
Since 2003, the northern section has organized and sponsored international planning tours to different parts of our globe. There have been 6 tours thus far, and the 7th tour was supposed to happen this fall, but it has been postponed. The main objectives of these tours are to explore cities with fellow travelers that share a common interest in urban planning. We also meet with our counterparts to understand the planning issues facing these cities and how they are responding to urban problems and challenges. We chat with university academics to learn about their urban planning programs and curriculum. And finally, we create a dialogue with the elected officials and how they deal with planning policies affecting their municipality. Next slide, please. As an outtake from the International Planning Tour, the Northern Section expanded our international program in 2013 to include international collaboration. By establishing continued relationships, we are able to exchange our urban planning knowledge and ideas with international governmental planners, educators, and planning organizations. Our first collaboration project was primarily a video conferencing with the municipality of São Paulo, Brazil, on regional governance and planning policies. The second collaboration was with the city of Ouro Preto, Brazil, and São Cristóvão neighborhood, which is also known as Veloso, and San Jose State University was involved, as well as APA. The project involved public outreach and capacity building for that neighborhood in Ouro Preto. Next slide. Roberto, next slide.
Sorry.
So at this point, I'd like to introduce Alex Hines, who is our co-international director of the Northern Section. Alex?
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Great to be on this webinar. It isn't a webinar. The purpose of today's get-together is to have a conversation, not a series of lectures. And it's really just to share information and ideas and go from there. Meanwhile, though, I think it's important to note that we had a rehearsal of this episode of this session a couple of weeks ago. And in the 2 weeks since our rehearsal, almost all the data has changed. So I'm going to try to stay away from numbers and just hit the high points very briefly. In the United States, the death toll in the virus outbreak has been rising rapidly, still in many places, some places not hardly at all. But it now surpasses 90,000 people. So the next slide, please. Roberto. Oh, thank you. So why is it contagious? Why is it spreading? Well, it comes out of our mouth in little droplets, and it gets on our hands, and it gets all over the place, hard surfaces. It multiplies geometrically. So there was a chance to try to prevent it from getting widespread early through testing and contact tracing and isolating, but the genie got out of the bottle. It spread very, very rapidly, and at this point, we're kind of in a bind. Next slide. It's a big mess. So as a result, essentially parts of the country, and California was one of the first to adopt this, began what some call a shelter in place, or some call stay at home. But basically, people were asked, some places required, not to go to work. Uh, and, um, and this went on for several weeks, and it managed to slow the spread down where it was done correctly, but at a great cost. And people understandably have responded with protests, and our economy has gone in the tank, millions of people unemployed. And we're now in the process of reopening the economy. In California, that's really going to be done in phases. We're in the second of a 4-phase approach, and we'll be talking about that more when the speakers present. Next slide. So one of the best ways to safely go back to work is for those of us lucky enough, fortunate enough to be able to telecommute. You're lowering your exposure, you're reducing your travel times and your commute, but that really applies to upper class, well-to-do, about 44% of them can do it, middle class about 30%, and people in the service industries and the working class, the poor, it's much more challenging for them to be able to telecommute. Only about 20% can do that. Next slide. So, is the office going to remain the same? We don't think so. And where the workplaces remain the same, many of us don't think so. So it's rethinking workplace. Will there be more plexiglass separators? Will people's temperatures be taken every day? Will there be different work shifts so that you can maintain social isolation of at least 6 feet? Stay tuned as this will be hotly debated and put into place. Next slide. So one of the core strategies of urban development, urban planning, is to essentially place higher density, higher intensity uses, apartments, offices, near public transportation hubs. And one of the challenges here in the United States has been, and particularly here in rural and suburban areas, has been to oppose density. And the question is one of the results of this pandemic going to be more opposition to high density development, or what's called transit oriented development, or will this just be a passing phase? Next one. And even our food systems are in peril. And Diana Benitez will be going over this in her presentation more, but it's not necessarily a lack of food, it's a lack of being able to distribute it and get it to the right places in the right markets at the right time, in the right way. Next one, please. So it's not just people protesting not being able to go back to work previously, it's not being able to go to our parks and our beaches. The question is, how can we get people back to enjoying the outdoors? It's healthy, enjoying the beaches and the parks, rather than just shutting them down. They're being reopened as we speak, but obviously, if you look at the photo, you can see people aren't wearing masks and they aren't practicing social distancing. So how to do it safely? And that will be addressed later in the presentation as well. Next slide, please. So this is Dr. Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx. They're on the White House coronavirus task force, dedicated professionals. And we as planners think we have a hard job. Take a look at their faces. They've been among the heroes. In addition to the emergency medical people and on the line service workers, people working in elder care facilities, these two epitomize hanging in there and being optimistic despite the despite the evidence. Not a laughing matter, excuse me, but I can relate. Next one, please. One of the byproducts is that with the stay-at-home orders and the contraction of our economy, there's a much lower demand now for fossil fuel. And so there's actually a parking problem for these big tankers, and they're being forced to park off the California coast. And none of us wished for that to happen through a pandemic or this terrible crisis that we're in the middle of. But as a result of it, there's been a lot less traffic congestion, greenhouse gas emissions, nitric oxide emissions, and frankly, some improvements in environmental quality, particularly air quality. Next one, please. Just about over with my piece. And finally, walking around my neighborhood the other day, I saw a new bumper sticker. Make the planet well again. Not just our individual selves or our communities, but the planet as well. Make it healthy and well again. And with that, that concludes my quick trip around what's going on here in California. So at this point, I believe I'm to segue in and talk a little bit about the agenda. First, I wanted to just thank a few people very quickly. Hing Wong is always the hardest worker in the room, I believe. I won't make a comment about him being the James Brown of the planning profession because he doesn't like it when I do that, but so I won't do that. But thank you, Hing. And Roberto Morris, not only is he an architect, but he has he's basically a civil engineer and a professor as well. And I'd like to think it's no accident that the slides he selected were thought-provoking and artistic, because as many of you may or may not know, Chile is the land of one of the best poets, ever produced, Pablo Neruda, and it's a place of, I would say, great sensibility and sophistication. So today we're going to really try to focus on what's going on in Chile and how that compares to the United States, and then and also look at the other countries that the Chilean PLANRED has been looking at. So Roberto will be our next speaker, followed by Suzanne Haig. Suzanne Haig is the former Deputy Director of the State Office of Planning and Research, and she'll be on deck after Roberto. So Roberto, it's all yours.
Roberto, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you very much. I will give you a short overview of what is happening in Chile. I will not take all the situation, just few things that I think, but I think it's important if you see this graph, how many events we had in the last 60 years, and especially in the period between 2005 and 2017. In Chile, we are very proud to be good with crisis. We have a lot of crises, and at the same time, in this period, we have a lot of different kind of events, but at the same time, really big. I'm just talking about big earthquake big volcano eruptions and fires. But at the same time, since 1906 with the earthquake of Valparaiso and in 1939 the earthquake of Chillán and 60 is we had been learning and doing a lot of um, changes, advances in our institutionality, and also new instrument, especially for earthquake. We are very proud to be a country of good for earthquakes. But at the same time, is we are not very focused on planning. We are very good at reacting and fixing. Very good reacting and fixing. That is why when we have a lot of events, we learn faster. Um, but at the same time, our experience has been connected with different countries, and one of them is the state, United States. You can see how in 1906 we had a major earthquake and fire in Valparaiso, where Valparaiso and San Francisco were the most important ports in the Pacific Ocean. In 1960, we had a really big earthquake. I will talk about that. The coup d'etat in 1973. And now we are having this common crisis at the same time. I have to say that today is very symbolic. Today is the 16th anniversary of the Valdivia earthquake. Is the most powerful instrumentally recorded earthquake in the history of humanity. 2,000 people died, more than 2 million victims in a country of a little bit more than 8 millions. Was very important for us. It's still important for the world. Another event that I would like to share with you is how in the government of Allende, in the Popular Unity government, one of the main things was the nationalization of strategic companies, how the copper companies. But I would like to take notice of this, how this poor country with 5 computers, they we needed to control the country and the production, and they invented this called the Chile's socialist internet, the project Cybersyn, which was following the ideas of Stafford Beer of how we can control, have a country in the way how we can control a company, and was a beautiful innovation of that moment, but was finished with the coup d'etat. But it's amazing how this very far and poor country was doing something very evolved for the time. Another highlight, important milestone is in 2010. For our generation, we thought that was important crisis. Now we know that it's not, but it was a really big earthquake. But the main thing that the tsunami, as I said, was something we didn't thought before. We weren't prepared for that, and we're still learning about that experience. Mary Comero, who is here, and William Zimbieda has been researching a lot about Chile, especially with this experience. The other, sorry, I figured out that image was before it should be, but I said that for the coup d'etat is I don't want to explain too much about the military regime, but I want to put focus in the how many goals represent for our society, because it was a very sad period. Of course, we have good news about the economic development. We still we can demonstrate how we innovate in a different way with the Chicago Boys, a model followers of Milton Friedman. You can see here Friedman with Pinochet, and that represents the phase of the economic reconstruction. But that model is still representing a lot of discussion in Chile. To think in our crisis without thinking in the crisis that started in the October of the 18th October of last year, where we had this social uprising for several months with a lot of destruction, where the people demonstrated they were tired of the model because of the inequality. I don't want to do an assertion of this process. It's just to say how important it is for us, because it's still conditioning our response, because it's a lot of violence, destruction of the public space, of the public infrastructure, but at the same time with a lot of beauty, because this movement is really moving the people, and a lot of art, but at the same time is an expression of violence in different ways, not just the proper violence in the streets, it's also the violence between the citizens, where friends, families, we had been discussing in a really bad way because we didn't train to how to do it in a proper way, in a civilized way, and now we are suffering because we didn't train conversation, communication, respect, empathy. But this duality is also connected with a huge movement of people taking the public space, asking to change the constitution. But now, how we are dealing with the crisis is quite well for some people, because we are not the worst, but at the same time we are worried. You can see how our curve is going up. We are still a poor country. We are the poorest of the most richest countries in the world, and because we are rich in some ways. You know, most of the country is poor. It's still poor, but I hope we can deal in a smart way. But at the same time, one of the things is we have to be aware of the problems, and one of the problems is how we can recognize our underlying factors. That is something beyond this COVID crisis, these previous conditions, the urban inequalities, vulnerabilities, the failures in governance, and the institutional distrust, and a lot of other problems. They were before the social uprising, that the social uprising increased the situation. And now, in a completely different kind of crisis, we are recognizing some common elements with that crisis. They are overlapping factors, which is something planners, we are quite aware of that. Inequality, frustration, sensation of discrimination, public response with the use of police and military force, violence, any kind of violence. This map is showing Santiago, the capital, where in this area is the most richest area, and you will see how here we started with people, cases from the richest area, because they were traveling, you know, they were tourists. Later, the cases moved to the poorer areas, the more vulnerable areas, because we decided to this partial lockdown. But now we have this total partial of the city, and now we are being in this discussion between how we have to be worried about the macroeconomics versus the public health, but at the same time, public health versus the macroeconomics, and how people is suffering because, for different reasons. And I want to finish with this, where we are quite worried, because this is our pictures of a few days ago. It looks pictures from the urban uprising, the social uprising, but they are, because they are they are angry because they are hungry, and at the same time the government is responding with the same tools of the police. I don't know, I don't know how to do it, but it's a fact that we are suffering similar conditions, and we are quite worried for that. And you can see the new cars, the same that state is using in Afghanistan. And but at the same time, the other kind of violence is crime. We have some indicators that are going down, but at the same time, we have very, very difficult situation because crime is evolving. And we are very worried about this situation. And of course, in 2 weeks, we have more and different information. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Roberto. It looks like Suzanne's next up, and then we're going to have a series of conversations of equal length to the talks. Suzanne, as I mentioned earlier, is the Deputy Director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and has recently taken on a new job with the Air Resources Board for the state of California. Suzanne, are you present?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I see that we're a little bit behind time, so I'm going to try to speed things up a little bit. And I can no longer see the slide. Let's see.
Do you want to see it?
Yes.
Yeah.
If you want me to speak to it, then
that would be great. Because I was showing your face.
Slides are probably better than the face. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, that's great. So I apologize. I have slides for sort of the opening pieces that that Alex and Hing put together, and thank you so much for that. And as Alex mentioned, I've been sandwiched in between jobs, so I don't have slides for everything that I'll talk about, but happy to follow up with anybody afterwards. So I'll quickly run through these. And first of all, we're in this phase of considerations around reopening workplaces and the economy. And step to that is, of course, to lower risk. And to the next slide, which I think just briefly outlines, the checklist approach from an evidence basis and the healthcare basis to what loosening restrictions might look like in terms of number of cases, and are the hospitalizations flat or decreasing? Is there enough PPE? All of these considerations. So again, just taking a very science-based approach here in California. Next slide. And then the state and local coordination is really essential. I'm going to hit on that a little bit more later on, but suffice to say that the state provides sort of the floor of minimum requirements, but California is a large state and there with a lot of different socioeconomic and environmental conditions. So locals and counties are also sort of piling on top of state requirements for their standards for being able to reopen. Next slide. So there's a link here to the OPR website. I also just put into the chat the link to the state's comprehensive COVID response website there, covid19.ca, which I think is a great source for just all the statistics and keeping track of all of the moving numbers as Alex mentioned day to day. So I have a couple of things that I want to touch on in terms of the state response as it relates to planning. First, I'm going to just highlight the difference in levels of government here in the US and in California, briefly touch on the approach as it relates to housing, transportation, and land use, and then a few brief takeaways, and I'll try to talk fast. So first of all, in terms of levels of government, we have federal support for disaster relief that is the same source of funds as for, say, natural disasters, but typically those funds are deployed on a place-by-place and case-by-case basis, so it is unusual, if not unprecedented, to have to distribute that funding nationally all at the same time. Therefore, we've also had legislation adding trillions of dollars in federal aid for various uses, and that's from the federal level. Then at the state level, the federal disaster relief and other federal funds actually flow through the state. So the state provides access to those federal dollars. Here in California, we've provided significant amounts of supplemental state funding as well. We were really fortunate to be in a budget surplus before the COVID crisis hit and have a significant rainy day fund as well. But that is all going away as we speak, and we are predicted to be well into a deficit by next year in some cases. So we're sort of finagling our annual state budget as we speak. There are, so in terms of state role, the state has some land use regulation capacity in terms of environmental and health standards, and we provide a lot of planning guidance, but we do not have direct land use control other than in parcels where the state specifically owns a key place. We provide organizing capacity and we provide regulatory relief where we can. So a lot is dependent on partnerships with local level government, cities and towns. Locals have land use authority. They sometimes provide local money and capacity and partnerships, but as you can imagine, it's very uneven from place to place. So part of the state's role is trying to shore up that unevenness and provide additional capacity and resources where needed. Briefly on housing, this has been a really important, something is beeping, so sorry. Speaking of the unprecedented, my son left his watch in my office. Housing, the housing approach has been primarily to address homeless vulnerability. So there's a project known as Project Room Key, where the state has provided access to hotels and motels. We're purchasing and leasing hotel and motel properties, which are of course largely vacant right now, and turning them into shelters to immediately get people off of the street and reduce their vulnerability to COVID disease. And then doing some long-term planning to help transition those properties into permanent supportive housing, which involves retrofitting the buildings, but also retrofitting the workforce that continues to serve, so that the workforce can continue to serve those properties. So transitioning people from working in a hotel to working in an apartment building, for instance. We're also working really hard to help people stay housed, people who are housed, but who might be, have increased vulnerability due to the economic crisis. So that looks like, one, providing regulatory authority where we can, for instance, an executive order from the governor banning evictions from rental properties statewide. That is something that we can do with regulatory authority for those who are renters. For those who own their homes, there is a different approach that involves the power of partnership with the private sector. So our governor forged an agreement with over 200 private lenders in the mortgage lending industry to provide mortgage relief to anyone suffering the economic effects of the current crisis. So basically, you know, you don't pay your mortgage, or you pay late, or you don't pay at all, depending on the specifics of the provider. But we're hoping that that helps to alleviate the significant housing crisis that we saw in the last recession in 2008, 10, and forward. And then finally, on housing, we're providing a lot of regulatory relief for projects, housing projects that contain state funding. So we have a number of funding programs at the state level that pay for housing production and housing asset management and so forth. And basically just trying to provide as much flexibility as we possibly can for all of those projects so that they don't fall under in difficult times. On transportation, you know, short term, I think the impact has been relatively clear. No pun intended, clear skies. Some places in California haven't had clear skies in decades and decades. Negative petroleum prices, so some petroleum industry folks are actually paying people to take crude off of their hands because of the drop in driving. That's a positive, but on the negative side, transit revenues, of course, hit extremely hard. One other positive has been a really increased emphasis on bicycling. So in the first weeks of this, we heard about, you know, shortages in flour and toilet paper and essentials. Now we're hearing about shortages in bicycles. If you want to buy a new bike, you have to get on a waiting list in many places, which is kind of cool. Longer term on transportation, I mean, we're looking at a lot of federal stimulus money coming in for infrastructure projects, and really working to align the state's priorities for that funding with our climate and equity priorities to make sure that that funding goes to projects with long-term benefits. Really quickly on land use, I think there are two things to note here. One is a slowdown in government processes because of the shift in working remotely, but I think that is now picking back up largely in most places. And the second is just the economic slowdown will result in a slower pace of real estate transactions and construction, and we know this through all the dips and turns in the economy over the years. On jobs and economic recovery, I wanted to mention the governor recently stood up a new task force with several prominent business leaders, really looking at this concept of what we refer to as high road job creation and high road recovery. This is a phrase that is probably easiest understood in contrast to its opposite, which is low road being the sort of race to the bottom approach of economic growth, where, you know, how cheaply can you pay people for how many hours to produce the most, you know, the highest number of things. On contrast, a high road approach looks at competition by job quality. So job quality includes not just wages, but also benefits and working conditions, long-term career trajectories, and what we call a just transition from a petroleum-based economy to a new, cleaner future. These have been really important pillars in the economic recovery planning, both short-term and long-term. So quickly, a couple of takeaways. I think the most vulnerable populations are hit first and worst. We know this in every type of crisis. Ghosts of history, past and present, are with us and are exacerbated. This is no surprise. But, you know, the racial disparities, inequities, especially with regard to our tribal communities, really get exacerbated and highlighted in these situations. But I think that this also creates an opportunity to raise awareness and to leverage that awareness for longer term recovery, to do things like accelerate housing solutions, to emphasize job quality and job access, to emphasize our dependence on our agricultural sector and agricultural workers. People are seeing, you know, shortages in food supply chains, and we realize, oh yeah, farm workers have, you know, extreme vulnerability in these and other situations. And finally, I want to close on just a comparison to climate. So my work is focused on aligning basically development, real estate and land use development with climate and equity goals. And so we think a lot about, you know, long-term climate risk, and I think there are some similarities and some differences, but I think the lesson that we take away seems to be that there are these abstract long-term models and sort of predictions out there. I think for a lot of people, climate change impacts still seem really far away and really abstract. And I think that the COVID crisis similarly seemed far away and abstract, and then in a matter of weeks became very, very real, which if you live in a place that has been impacted by climate related, you know, disaster, you know, can happen with climate too. So I'm hoping that we hold that awareness as we move forward into the future. I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Suzanne. How about some questions? Anyone have a question of Suzanne at this point? Speak up, or I'll
Alex,
do the first if no one.
Julia Leib has a comment. And also a question of Mary.
Oh, no comment. I just wanted to thank Alex for the great session and the rest of the folks. And I also had typed in that I was talking to a friend of mine in Paris this morning, and the mayor there has given every resident a €50 credit towards purchasing or repairing a bicycle. And I thought that that was a great way to get people out and bike riding. So, but no question other than to say that I've really enjoyed this presentation, and I appreciate the opportunity to learn about what other countries are doing.
Thank you, Julia. The question from Mary is, given that recovery will take years, one strategy for jumpstarting the economy is to invest in infrastructure. In the broadest sense, is there an opportunity to improve disaster resiliency into those investments?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question, Mary. We are working on a series of, basically we're referring to as criteria and principles and priorities around how we spend recovery dollars. And you're absolutely right that disaster resilience is at the fore of those, in addition to a few other things. One is a focus on equity and really looking at not just the populations and places that are most impacted by the current crisis, but also the populations and places with the greatest level of underlying vulnerability. Also the ability to align those infrastructure investments with disaster resilience, with climate resilience, and with climate mitigation efforts to reduce greenhouse gases. And then again, those high road job criteria are also kind of a lens through which we are looking at prioritizing infrastructure funding that's coming in to the state.
So are there any more questions for Suzanne or even for Roberto, who spoke about Chile prior to Suzanne's presentation?
Hing, I would like to say something about Mary's question.
Okay.
I think it's a good opportunity to think in multi-scale infrastructure, actually social infrastructure, in the way how Eric Klinenberg is talking about in his book of Palaces for the People. I think we need to think in a very smart way how every kind of investment have to be prepared for different kind of services. You know, I think we will have very difficult times in the future, but we have very good experiences. In his book, we can see how that kind of projects, we don't need to be in a very powerful and wealthy country. We can do it everywhere, because it's mainly to be smart, you know, and to be open to the needs of a community, and not just to think in the physical part. It's also how we can connect the diagnosis with the projects and the management with the people, not just the government, is involving the community in the management of these infrastructures.
You know, and Hing, before we go on to the next comment, I just want to point, this is a great example of how we can learn from each other. Bus rapid transit really developed with an architect, planner, mayor in Curitiba, Brazil, named Jaime Lerner, and Ciclovia, which is often called Safe Streets here in the States, developed in Colombia with Enrique Peñalosa, another architect, planner, mayor. So it's a multi-directional learning process, and let's keep these questions coming, or if not, we'll move on to the next speaker.
Oh, we move on right now since we don't see any more questions, and we'll have more opportunities to chat and ask questions after the next few presenters. Alex, do you want to introduce Miguel?
Yeah, I do. Although for some of us, Miguel needs no introduction. He's one of the first certified planners hired by a public health department in the nation. He works for the Riverside University Health System, and he's trying to strengthen the integration of planning and health through collaboration with non-traditional partners. And he's also from Xochimilco, Mexico originally. Did I say that right, Miguel? And here's Miguel.
Thank you so much, Alex. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, good morning, everybody. Buenos días, buenas tardes, no sé qué tiempo sea en su hora. It is a pleasure to be able to join this group and share a few reflections. I don't necessarily have a presentation per se, but I like to answer some questions that we developed as this session was organized. So here we go. But before I answer the question, I just quickly want to mention that I am here as a professional. I do have an affiliation with our local health department in Riverside County, California. I've been working as an embedded planner in doing public health work, meaning at the intersection of public health and planning for the past 10 years. And one of the things that I am very excited about is the work that we've been doing through the American Planning Association under the umbrella of the Planners for Health California, which right now is doing a series of webinars to keep our planners abreast on what the response is at the local, state, and national level from planners on different issues that have come as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. So the first question is, how has the COVID-19 crisis disproportionately impacted people of color, the elderly, and the poor? So my reflection on this is, this pandemic truly has impacted all of us, either directly or indirectly, but the level of impact really depends on various factors that I would say begin at the personal level in the form of our lifestyle and the choices that we make. And in other words, that could mean our behavior. Our behavior is shaped, as we know, by our culture, our personal beliefs, religion, political affiliation, educational level, income, and even social media. Now, one important factor is actually that the place where we live, work, and play, which would be a combination of what we know as the built environment and natural environment, which provide the opportunities and the choices that we can make. And those choices actually can be translated into the different envelopes that enclose our personal environments. And that would be our home, or the block where we live, or neighborhood, or city, or state, or nation, and certainly our world. Now, there is this idea that our zip code is in fact a measure that has more influence, or that can determine more or individual health outcomes than our own genetic code. Now, having said that, we have not only the data, but also the stories that validate a very real and stark picture of inequalities in the state. Now, Roberto mentioned a lot of poverty in Chile. Well, the United States is no stranger to poverty. In the United States, we have also places where poverty expresses in different ways than in other countries, but the needs of the people are basically the same, where there is human infrastructure, the lack of clean water, lack of opportunities to resources, good education, good paying jobs, and so on and so forth. And I want to share very quickly a site, which is the CALenvirus Screen Mapping Platform. If you want to switch to the next slide. I think that could give us, let's go up to the next one. That could give us a good glimpse. Actually, let's go down. And let's see if you can click to that, to the link right there, and see if we can take a look at the map of California as shown by CALenvirus Screen. And you will see there are different colors that range from red to green, and you can keep scrolling down, and somewhere you can click on the map. Oh yeah, keep going down, and then just accept. And what the colors tell you is the distribution of inequities in the state of California. And don't be fooled by all the green. There is a relationship between geography and density. And if you were able to zoom in metropolitan areas like Riverside, San Bernardino, LA County, the Bay Area and certainly the Central Valley, you will see that the most pervasive inequities exist in places that are populated mainly by people of color. Now, just to give you one example of what this means in terms of the impact, just very quickly, because I've been working with one of those communities in the Eastern Coachella Valley for almost 10 years since I started working for the Department of Public Health. And this community was fighting for better public transportation in the Eastern Coachella Valley. Now, Coachella is known now for, an international music festival. But behind that idea of the glitziness of the festival, there is tremendous poverty in need. So this community was fighting for better planning, and they actually were able to achieve the development of a mobility plan that actually was recognized this year by the American Planning Association with a national award. Now the plan is in place, but the question that we have now is, how is this plan going to be implemented with limited resources? I think that the idea of the conception that we had 2 months ago was very different than the idea we can have as to when these improvements will happen. So progress has been made, but as Suzanne and Alex mentioned, the issues that we had 2 months ago, in terms of disparities, they still exist, and now they are exacerbated, and actually more people are falling into that idea of disparities. Now the second question, and I'll try to let's see, how's my timing? I think
wow, 2 more minutes.
I talked too much. So let me then just close with the second question. Are there any specific lessons and beneficial responses that could be considered by Chile and others during and after the pandemic? I think I'm going to go off script, and I think this could be also how I would be responding to the second question. And basically is that we are at a point where organizing ourselves is key. And this platform and this time that we're spending together here is one stepping stone into that, learning from one another and coalescing. I am in the process of putting together, actually I have already assembled a group of planners, architects, public health professionals, and advocates to develop a set of principles for equitable planning and healthy communities post-COVID-19, because the world really is different, and we need to ensure that the work that we did in terms of addressing inequities, starting from dismantling a system of structural racism, is more important than ever. And this idea or this project will help us to reinforce and validate and bring the conversation to the highest level, so that all of our planners, planners who are practicing, and also our future generations, planners who are in school, younger planners, and people who are about to get into more prominent roles, they know where the priorities of planning, design, architecture, and public health are. So organize, organize, organize. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share.
Thank you, Miguel. Alex will introduce our next speaker, Diana, and right after Diana, we'll have our conversation chat.
Well, speaking of up-and-coming planners, Diana Benitez is an intermediate planner at Ramey & Associates, a consultant group that specializes, in my opinion, in just about all the right issues. She's also the Planners for Health coordinator for the northern section of APA. She's good technically. She's good with knowing the right things to study, and she's going to be good with telling us the answers to the questions, and in particular, what are some of the specific roles and responsibilities you think planners should be undertaking when you get around to that second question? Deanna.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, buenos dias, buenas tardes. If you could go to the next slide. I want to talk to you today about healthy eating and active living. And so if we get started with healthy living here in the United States and in California, as Miguel was mentioning, we have inequities, and lack of access to grocery stores and supermarkets is something that we've had before COVID. And during this pandemic, what we've been seeing is a rise in unemployment, which is also making it harder for people to have access to food. And as we're seeing earlier, or if you've been going to our grocery stores in the last few weeks, you were seeing that we were experiencing long lines. There were empty aisles because people were stockpiling. And as Alex mentioned, food was rotting. And if you go to the next slide, the actions that have been happening up and down the state have, from planning perspectives, have been providing flexible zoning, particularly lifting noise restrictions like loading and unloading, so that the aisles can get filled up. And so we can have trucks coming in during off hours, so we can get our grocery stores back up and running, curbside pickup to allow restaurants to deliver food, or for people to be able to access that food without getting ticketed. We've seen a lot of easing of parking enforcement, which has also helped. What we've also seen is things like farmers markets, farm and produce stands, and nurseries being included as essential businesses. And I live in Berkeley, and I have neighbors that are starting to grow food for the very first time. And so it's been really interesting to see that. We've also seen free public transit up and down the state, and that's ranged from jurisdictions saying we're removing fees, it's going to be free, or de facto free, meaning like in Los Angeles, you can enter from the back entrance of the bus, and so you technically don't have to pay. But this is really important because it gives people the opportunity to have access, have that mobility to be able to go to work, because we still have a lot of essential workers, and to be able to get to that food. And to Alex's image earlier, I wanted to mention that the federal government in the last few weeks has committed to purchasing $300 million a month in surplus vegetables to make sure that they get to food banks. And we're trying to stop that waste that we were seeing. And I did quickly want to mention that not all small businesses are being supported in the same way. I wanted to emphasize street vendors who, before this pandemic, were providing access to food because they're mobile and they're able to go from different parts of the city. And that pre-COVID, throughout the state, they've been criminalized, and they are currently not considered an essential business. And jurisdictions are starting to talk about thinking about having mobile food options when they've already existed. And so it's important to really think about creative and other ways of providing these services, and also thinking about what infrastructure we do have and who we can continue supporting. And so if you go into the next slide, I also wanted to quickly give a few examples about active living. And so as we've seen, parks and beaches have been closed for social distancing. Recently, they've slowly been opening up again. And we've been experiencing crowds like this that make it a little dangerous for everyone, because we're trying to flatten this curve. And so if you go into the next slide, we understand that when you close these spaces, not everybody has access to big backyards or these large spaces in their neighborhoods to be able to stay physically active. And I want to emphasize that decreases in physical activity impact your health, not just physically, but also mentally. So increased risk of depression, lack of sleep, obesity, stroke, and a lot of other issues. And so what jurisdictions have been doing up and down the state, as I mentioned, slowly opening up these spaces with a few restrictions, taking into consideration that you have to still wear masks, social distancing has to be kept in place. Some jurisdictions are only opening up for active uses, others are permitting passive uses. And we also have seen some jurisdictions closing parking lots. And this is all to try to reduce the amount of overcrowding. But this has issues in some cases because what we've been seeing up and down the state in some instances, when parks first started opening up, they were opening up in wealthier neighborhoods and not in working class neighborhoods. But this connects to a larger issue that we've had here in California, where working class communities and communities of color lack access to these parks. They're not located in their neighborhoods. And so what you end up seeing when these jurisdictions close parking lots is that they're reinforcing that lack of access. And so someone that doesn't live close to a park is driving and making their way over. They can't find any parking, so they can't get out of their car and they can't stay active. And I do also want to mention that in San Francisco this week, if a few of you have been seeing, they've been opening up some parks and permitting passive uses, and they've been spray painting large circles to try to show the distance that people need to keep so that they can actually go to the park and sit. They don't necessarily need to be running or biking or constantly staying active. And so another thing that I also want to point out is that while this has been happening, we've also seen jurisdictions thinking, well, how can we bring these spaces, these opportunities for physical activity to where people live, particularly when you see that some neighborhoods have that lack of access to parks. And so that's where the slow streets or the open streets that Alex mentioned earlier come in, which of course is inspired by Ciclovia from Colombia. And in the right tweet, I have an example from Oakland called Slow Streets, where they've currently closed, I think now a little over 20 miles of residential streets to cars so that people can stay active. They can walk, they can run, they can bike. And they've selected a lot of these roads by taking a look at their proposed bike plan routes. And they've also done an equity analysis where they take into consideration where people who lack access to parks live, where communities of color live, where low-income households live, and a lot of other factors. And they've also started to ramp up their community input. And one thing that I do want to say about this, if you go into the next slide, is that the community input is really important. And in some cases, these open streets across the nation have been critiqued because some vulnerable populations are still struggling to meet their basic needs. The basic needs of food and shelter, transportation, health and safety. And so at this point, physical activity isn't the thing at the top of their list, and they're trying to make sure that they can get to work as essential workers, and that if there's an emergency, that emergency response vehicles can get to them. And I also wanted to emphasize that we, here in this country, Black and brown people do not feel safe in public spaces because of the history of racism that we have. And the criminalization and violence that we experience by the police and other members of the public is really real. And I have an image here of Ahmaud Arbery because a few weeks ago, we were reminded of this when footage was released of him being murdered. He was a Black man from Georgia, and he was jogging in his neighborhood when two white men killed him because they thought he was trying to rob houses, when he had jogged in his neighborhood multiple times and he was out on the public space in the sidewalk. And so this calls to point the importance of community input to not only determine if these services are needed, but if they're wanted. Because if people don't feel safe in accessing these spaces, the programs aren't as useful in those communities. And if you go into the next slide, for the second question talking about hopes and concerns, I think that community input is critical. And at this time, we need to continue engaging communities because planning has been considered an essential business, and we see things moving forward. Things have been slowed down, but there's still an expectation to continue developing affordable housing. There's still a lot of deadlines that we have to meet. I know from a consultant perspective, submitting information on the vehicle miles traveled, submitting information on our regional housing needs assessment. We are still moving forward with things. And I think it's important, in particular, to focus on how to engage vulnerable communities. And these include all of the people that Miguel was talking about, because all of these people are the ones that are being impacted the most. A lot of the inequities that we're seeing, the food and economic insecurity that I mentioned, the lack of park access, the unaffordable housing that Suzanne was talking about, it all connects, and it's not something that is brand new. It's something that we've been experiencing here in this country. And so we need to continue working towards developing more equitable policies, and in particular, more policies that take health into consideration. And it's the reason why I became a planner. It's the reason why I'm speaking here in front of you all today. And if you go into the next slide, I just want to briefly say a few things that we've been learning, that it's helpful to continue to act fast for critical responses to help vulnerable populations. As a few mentioned, California was one of the first to enact a stay-at-home order. I do want to say Puerto Rico was the very first in the US. We've seen the free public transit that some jurisdictions have been providing. That's been really, really, really important. And a lot of that quick acting with that flexible zoning to provide more of that access to food. It's also important to move slowly on big decisions. As you've heard Suzanne says, that some things have slowed down, but we are still moving. And so we need to make sure that communities have time to process what's been happening both physically and mentally before we can start engaging with them again. And of course, we need to continue virtual engagement to gather community input. And I know that up and down the state, around the nation, we've all been working on this and trying, from quickly learning how to do Zoom calls like this one, or going back to making phone calls and looking at home trees and text messaging. But it's important to continue. And last but not least, we need to continue health equity work. As Suzanne and Miguel, even Roberto has mentioned, like, a lot of these inequalities have existed, and we need to strive to do better and to create healthier, safer, and more affordable communities. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Deanna. And how about some questions for either Miguel or Deanna, and in Spanish or in English? Anybody online ready to go?
Yep, there's a question, Alex. Do you want to read it?
Is this the one from Sarah Wilkie?
Yes.
From Watsonville? For Diana, where can I find some good case studies for outreach and engaging communities with vulnerable populations, specifically for open street initiatives and reconfiguring public spaces, outdoor dining, etc., for jurisdictions also with vulnerable populations?
Sure. So hi, Sarah. I would recommend, I was reading up last week, I think Nelson Nygaard has released, where is it? I actually just had it open. Principles for Equitable Public Outreach and Engagement During COVID. Nelson Nygaard is a firm that focuses on transportation, and they've been doing a lot of active transportation work. And so they have a lot of really good recommendations on things that they've done that you can take a look.
Great. How about some others? We don't want to let Miguel off easy. Any other questions or comments? We're running a few minutes behind, but we started a few minutes late, so I'm not worried about it. Going once, twice. Well, let's introduce Paula Alfaro, an architect who also holds a doctorate degree in urban studies. So she's an architect, an urbanista, and a professor. She's from Germany, but I believe you're still in Chile as a result of the fallout of the pandemic. So Roberto, did you have any comments more to introduce Paula?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
No, just to say that Paula is representing full people because we had a conversation about the experiences in Germany with Lorena Valdivia, Álvaro Valero, and Vicente Sandoval. They had been working together in this presentation, and I think Paola will be talking on behalf of them. Paola.
Yes, so thank you very much, firstly, for the introduction. And in fact, Alex, what you are mentioning is really quite true. I'm also a victim of pandemia. So I'm actually stranded still in Santiago de Chile while I have my team working in Berlin. So it is a little bit a struggle and a thing what I'm actually doing. And yes, so far what Roberto was saying is that I will do a presentation here for let's say with me, 4 colleagues of the working in Berlin, also involved as teachers, researchers in the built environment disciplines. And we have 2 questions here, right, for 10 minutes, as I understand. And one is a little bit to understand what kind of lessons do we learn from Germany, let's say, or even in particular from Berlin. And on the other hand, and this is a thing which drives me in particular a lot, is this kind of questions: what planners, what role are we currently playing, and what could we play from the built environment disciplines, let's say in this first phase of Corona, but also now, right? That things we are entering now into a new normality or into current life, and I think there it is very important to understand a little bit how we can we start to do things together. The next slides, please. The next slide. Hello. Yes. So what I did here is I tried to summarize the work of my other colleagues, also to present you response also to my 2 questions that I have here. And the first one is by Álvaro Valera Sosa, who in particular, and I think this is something which is very important when it comes to how we are actually also engaging in Germany with this kind of, from our built environment disciplines to the Corona. And this is something which I think is very important, is that a lot of architects are also involved in things which might be not so much evident for architects, right? And if you look, for example, to Álvaro Valera Sosa, he is working in particular with the health care and also with the health development sector in our department at the Technical University in Berlin. So he's very much specialized on one hand as an architect, even in particular to this understanding on how you can provide proper linkages in terms of, let's say, built environment, let's say at the physical built environment done by the hospitals. On the other hand, also to make this kind of technical and also management cycles so that you can invent better or think better on how to do this. And I think this is and he was, when he started to present what for him is important, the first thing that he said here is that hospital networks are really resources, right? And resources that can be very much designed in a particular way to what we need. And there he was saying, on one hand, it's important to provide, obviously, this kind of exhausting of the system in itself. But on the other hand, he was also explaining and making here in this presentation clear that, for example, we, in particular, there is this kind of proposal here to make this kind of health maps to allocate resources in terms to understand where people can be brought to, where also, and this is also the trace back and again to the community, is where is the need also from different parts of the community to have this kind of let's say, hospitals, care systems, and so forth. So it's avoiding this understanding of to have something very central where everybody needs to go to, and instead of providing something which is a certain aspect very much related with which different residential zones also, and also on different different care systems. On one hand, he's talking about this kind of urban care where parts of the hospitals can be very close to the neighborhood itself, and also this understanding of residential care. It means that there might be some solutions of this process which could be even more located in smaller areas and in let's say in parts of this neighborhood itself, to at least think on a neighborhood health loop that, for example, does not need to have one supplier in a big hospital where everybody will run to this and will by the end will be exhausted with this kind of demanding situation, right? So this is something which on one hand gives us an understanding of how we can work with a very decentralized system, which I think, and I will also present this to you later, is part also of our German, in particular part of our German, let's say, society, not to be centralized, rather more to work as a state nations in different smaller units in itself. So the next one. On the other hand, what also is so important is, and here I highlighted in particular for the first moment of when Corona came, is this the statement of Lorena Valdivia Steele, who was saying that, by the way, science over politics in fighting this coronavirus. So she was very much emphasizing on the role that in particular also, let's say, scientists have in this in our society, actually in Germany, also to relieve the politicians and also to make a statement which is more believable than only when a politician stands in forehand of you, than rather to say we trust on also on our scientists and we have a common plan all together. So it means that there was this kind of thinking also to, and you see this here in the curve itself, where they was saying the hammer means of course there is this kind of moment where we have to make solutions which are very quickly, right? But then it's coming to this kind of the dance, which means there it is very much required that different actors are playing together, that there is also an understanding on what really means to have a democratic society, in terms of that we have to trust to each other, and while we are trusting to each other, we also have a compromise together. And this is something which sounds very easy, but by the way, I think this was also part of what was, let's say, the successful part of this German solutions, by the way, that we had this kind of understanding that because we have this kind of very, let's say, big public service here and a very rich public service, which is all part of also the let's say the taxes that we are paying. We don't have to forget that we all are paying 40 to 50% of our salaries are going into our tax system, right? So the volume that we have is very high, and therefore this entire, let's say, budget that we had there was also a kind of on one hand, a compromise that you give to the state, but also this is the mass of responsibility that the state has to provide solutions to the people that are paying into this kind of taxes system. And I think, therefore, this understanding of a democratic society is very important in itself. And also that a democratic system is not done by one hierarchical persons, then rather by a kind of a multi-actors system, which are providing from different disciplines the solutions here. And this was very important. And what also, next slide, please, we can see here, is also what Lorena Valdivia was explaining on how we are now entering into this kind of dancing fast, right? Where we, of course, there is this need also now to handle with this situation on, and what you see here are long measurements where, for example, they are opening up actually the first shops, the first restaurants in the city itself. This is a very central part in Berlin, Friedrichstraße, so where the river is running through, and we have one of our transportation hubs here in Berlin. And what people are trying to say here is very clear that there is a credibility in what is this kind of solution that has been taken. And now we have to try to make it working. And this is something where, for example, the science play a very important role, but not only the science in its measurement, than rather also in the belief that it has in the society itself. And I think this is something which presents also the second phase, and where when you are asking me what role we are playing from the built environment disciplines, then there is something about this kind of understanding of interdisciplinarity, which plays a very important role in this examples that I have presented here, and also on the aspect of that the built environment disciplines are also a transdisciplinary context, in terms that we are not only working with the academia here, we also have to work with politicians supporting and trying also to navigate this field, right? And on the other hand, we have to make this kind of agreements with different parts of the society in itself. Next one. Here, for example, again, what Álvaro Valera Sosa was saying, what I was explaining you in the forehand, that, for example, this systematic planning here, and we are also here also questioning a little what kind of planning do we need when we are talking about the built environment disciplines, right? So we're thinking on, do we have to, on one hand, work with different disciplines, is what I said. I also said that we have to work with different parts of the society, but here he was also, Álvaro was also explaining that we need to understand also very deep into our knowledge, also where we can also become a let's say, a professional, an expert, also in addition to what we are doing as an architect, as an urbanist, to become part, for example, as a response for the logistic, for example, for hospital networks, for healthcare staff, and to avoid something which obviously every country is very much suffering from, this kind of impacts of a lockdown. So Álvaro was explaining, and this was his strategy, to say, if we can avoid that, for example, we don't have to lock us down so long time, which is bringing, beside the economical impacts that it has, ultimately it has also a lot of problems also for the mentality and the health of everybody in itself. The next one, please. This is one that I already presented. It was in the first part. Next one. And here, again, coming from by Vicente Sandoval, I would here also like to enter more in this kind of dense fast, what Lorena was explaining in with his fast, that we have a first fast of emergency, but then we have this kind of other fast where actually we are also entering into this, and what started here by the end of April, and it's still running, and it encompassed a slow but a progressive, sometimes named de-escalated return to a new normality. Can I have the next slide here, please? Exactly. So on one hand, we have this educational centers which are gradually open up, and things have started in particular with more elder children, so that they can understand how we can take this distance, we can use masks. But on the other hand, and this is what you see here, is the retrofitting of a whole infrastructure, right? And these are cycleways here in Berlin, and what actually the municipalities in combination with the state are doing are again taking this logistic of what everybody's actually talking about, this 1.5 meter society, which we will start to open up to be able somehow to go back to a certain normality, but start to understand how we can do this. And I think this is a quite clear example on how you take a measurement, and you have to implement this in a, let's say, in a public space. And this is my next point that I would like to do here, to understand that this are all done by a public service in a public space, right? So this is a point which is very important in the society itself. Next one, please. So in here, I think I put this on one of the last slides, and this was in particular my contribution to this, because as we want to understand a little bit how things are developed actually in Germany, and this is also what one of my four presenters here had said also, that they are very much related with a certain local culture, right? So it's not that a lot of things has been implemented in a new way. It's rather more also to test, and I would say this is also in particular the case when we look to Germany, a kind of a tradition, or let's say a political but also economical and a social development of certain things. And what I'm presenting you here is, for example, on one hand, and I think that's very important, where Germany was able, for example, we know that this is a federal state. So what counts for Bavaria will never count for Berlin. And what Berlin wants, the Bavarian will never agree if they are not convinced to that, right? And this is a thing which on one hand requires a lot of taking decisions together, also finding consensus, but requires also and gives us the possibility to have this kind of local possibilities to react differently. And for example, things which are in Berlin different or are in other solutions are in Bavarian completely different, because they have another, let's say, contamination actually as Berlin has, and therefore the solutions are different. And on the other hand, I think this is something which also was already stated by Lorena in the first slides, this understanding of the scientists, let's say a publicly also presented agreement between politicians and science, which is also something which is a part of what we talk our integrative planning of Germany in itself, right? Where we have already defined for us this understanding that we have a multi-actors approach, where we are working interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary in the way to work with different parts of the society in itself. And when you see here, this is in additionally also important when we are thinking on this kind of interdisciplinary approach that is actually so vivid when, for example, people are publicly asked, for example, from the Robert Koch Institute, are publicly asked, they have podcasts, they are asked on how they are taking measurements to somehow develop together this kind of a plan of a new normality. And I think this is something where I do believe that we from the built environment can learn a lot, because I mean, honestly, we are in itself, the built environment discipline is something which is very interdisciplinary, right? And this is the next slide where I would really like to show very shortly show you what I'm talking about. This is actually where I am working for the Bundesstiftung Baukultur. So this is a association, also a public associations of planners and architects. What we are actually doing, and we do this every year, is that we give a report on how is the situation of the built environment in Germany, right? So it's the Baukultur report. So it's a report about the building environment, and I am in particular actually this year responsible for public space. And there already is this understanding, of course, we have to work with the corona effect, that we will have to run it over what means for us public space today. And on the other hand, learning from what happened actually in this crisis, it is a state of mind. It means it is not only a physical space, it is a political body. And it's a body which is very much like where we have to agree, right? Where we have to agree from different parts of the society what we need to do with this space. And it's not a thing that we can, in our perception, do centrally and only by one person in itself, right? So it's also to understand what does it mean to have this kind of interdisciplinary knowledge production. And I think, and this is something which I very much appreciate that we are talking actually about, is this understanding of equity. Because if we look again to what really public space means, and if we take it as a political body, then of course we need to have their equity. And this could be really where we as planners can engage to that, because this is where we might be experts into this. What does it mean to have a public space where we can develop equity? And I was just running for last week for Cities Alliance, the part of the European part of the United Nations. We were running a webinar on this aspect of equity and growth. And I'm very happy to share what we are discussing here, because we understand that we need to learn a lot on this, actually, because it is not so easy, by the way, to understand how we can engage again with a completely new set, which is over us, that it is somehow distancing us than rather the coronavirus, than rather it's helping us to come closer. But on the other hand, we have to understand not to fragment in different parts of the society, then rather again be in a space together, and where everybody has a space or has a place again into that. And this is the next slides where I would like to finish with this slide, where we here are positioning ourselves in the Baukulturbericht. So this is the report for how is the situation on the built environment in Germany. And I do believe, and this is what here is important, it's a process, by the way. It's a process where we are all trying to make a point, and where it's not forgiven that we will not fail, but we have to try and to go for something, and then see how we will end up in different states. And maybe we have to go back. And this is something which has not done by me, this kind of phasing. It's pretty much more how do, again, also is this kind of tradition to say it's a process where we try to work together, but we have to check this, and we have possibly also to go back and make it better, but we try to be in our way. And I think this is also something which is very important when it's coming to what we are actually thinking here in how to improve and how to give a report on how public space can be further developed with and after Corona. Yes, thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you, Paula. Hey, how about we take questions right now while Paula and all of you are still with us. And I think we have something from Miguel Vasquez, and he's got it for everyone, but it's really sounds like it's for Paula. Can you comment on the tension between public health and economic development pre-COVID-19 in Germany, and how that reflects the country's response to the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I'm here standing in forehand of you for the 3 and 4 persons, right?
Oh, sorry. Did you get Miguel's question?
Yes, I got Miguel's question. Yes, so firstly, the question is the health system and the economic relationship with the pandemic, is that right?
Well, his comment is that comment on the tension between public health and economic development.
I think, Paola, he's asking about the conditions before the pandemic and how, the impact of that relationship between health and economic before and now.
And I think I can expand a little bit on the question, because there's this notion that Germany has a very strong social safety net, including public health. I understand that, you know, people pay high taxes to be able to do that, and it's different here in the States. So it seems to me that public health actually is valued as part of a healthy and strong economy. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that idea, you know, validate that or not, in how that perhaps has been one of the reasons why the country decided to, you know, start opening up when they began to make those decisions, and what you see into the future actually as part of that relationship between the economics of economic development per se and public health.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe 3 statements here, right? First, the first statement I think was done already by Merkel, which I think is very important. She from the beginning said the corona crisis is not only, let's say, a pandemic in terms of a health crisis, it's also economic crisis in itself, right? It means that We have to understand that what we will do here is a thing which of course will somehow of course the economic needs to somehow suffer from that. That's true, right? And this was something which this kind of response was, or let's say this statement was very quickly done. Secondly, I mean, it's different when you as a chancellor are saying this, right? And you have a strong public system beyond you. It means that you are able to, what kind of decision you take, you are able to implement this, right? Because you have the money, the resources, and you have at least also the constitutional responsibility to do it. Right? So therefore, I think it is a system that helps us very much. And there you can also see Sweden did the same, right? So they have also very strong public system, right? Where they were very much able to react very quickly because of that. And they were also cushioned to do that. Otherwise, everybody would be wonder, what are you doing with this whole public money? Right? So this is what this is why I was important and very keen to make this kind of distinction on, we are paying 40 to 50% of our salary, each of us, right? So, and this is a lot. It means, by the way, like, 30,000 euros the year you pay on taxes, right? I think all of us would pay, each of you would pay this if you live in Germany, right? And that means that what you have there, it's one of the richest public system in the world, right? And therefore, if you take the decision now to enter into the Corona, how to say, to fight Corona, right? We built hospitals for that. We are actually bringing also people from Italy, from France, from different parts of Europe, that they have this kind of possibility to get their a decent treatment. This is investment, where we are also building up a new, let's say, economy on the health system itself. So this is why I'm saying that, by the way, it's a decision, right? But it's also that you also navigate and change your, let's say, your economical system with that, with the new need that it requires. And I think this is a way to do it, and it is a way that helps to do things on a fast track, I would say, and with a lot of money, which in other parts of the world people are even struggling with that, because you can say whatever you want. If the private sector, the investors, are not willing to support you, then you as a politician either stands there as a liar or are not able to do this in a decent manner, right? And I think this is something which was in Germany very, let's say, positive, to have this kind of public system which can be thought as a, let's say, what we in Germany usually like to say, as a social economical contract among all of us. Yes, so this is a gloomy word that our politicians love to say, but I think this is very much good explained in this coronavirus, how it is really working. Mm-hmm. But yes, and maybe also another point which is also important is that also we have learned a lot of our crisis that we had with a lot of migration in the country itself. I don't know, I think you all listened about that we had, that a lot of migrants came, and our chancellor was also asked, and what are we going to do now with them, right? And there was not this kind of phasing, there was not this kind of procedure thinking and everything like that, and also not this kind of a closed common opinion on something. And I think this is very different now from what is going on, but this is a learning. And this, I would say, is a learning that is able, because we are all paying into the system, because they have time to think. But this, and the money is that what is helping to get this time. And this is also what Lorena was saying in the beginning. We bought us more time to work on the solution.
Well, thank you, Paula. Yes, thank you. I think it's about time to wrap up our session. I don't see any other questions. So Roberto or Alex, do you want to give a quick summary of our session today?
Well, I'd like to defer to Roberto in the last few minutes. Let's try to wrap it up in before the end of the hour. But Roberto, did you want to make some closing comments, or did you want to very briefly hit the highlights that that David was going to do on the takeaways from each of the country?
No, I would like just to say thank you to everybody. I think, as you said, this is evolving. For me, I wouldn't be doing a lot of comments. The difference between Italy in the beginning and now Mexico. But anyway, I think Germany is a very interesting case of how they are taking advantage of previous policies in public policies, the level of culture, but at the same time, a very interesting case of leadership. I think is for all of us is good to be aware of the different experiences. And as in the case of Chile, we are worried but optimistic.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for participating and coming. And if you want to provide additional comments or suggestions for improvement, let us know. And we look forward to continuing to work together and sharing information and learning from each other. And Hing, any closing comments from you?
No, thank you. And there will be future conversations. We're trying to do a few more with our Chilean colleagues in other parts of the U.S. And I know that they have other ones planned for other countries as well. But the website you see on one of the last pages of the PowerPoint presentation, that's the website that if you click on, it'll have a taping of this seminar, this conversation, and it'll have all the information for the upcoming events too. So thank you everyone for joining, and stay safe.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you to
all.
everybody.
Goodbye. Take care, everyone.
Bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Stay
Hasta luego.
safe. Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.